We welcome you to our second panel of the day. And before I begin that, I actually had someone come up to me and say, we never asked this question, I don't know much about Hillsdale College. We have a lot of faculty members this year who have never attended one of our events before, and they're from colleges, of course, all over the United States and Canada. Hillsdale College accepts no federal or state tax money. We're only a very, very energized group of people who believe in the freedom that this country has, and we want to protect it. And we are privately funded for everything we do. So that is Hillsdale in a nutshell. Now, the Free Market Forum is, as I said last night, an extension to all of these faculty members, and we love having the state policy leaders here. We work with the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities and the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty, and our panel chairman today is with the Acton Institute, Kris Mauren. Kris could not be with us here last night because he had an event in Texas, and then he flew in the evening, but we're so glad he's here today, and he's on our advisory committee for this program. Kris is actually the co-founder and executive director of the Acton Institute, and he has worked with that organization since 1990. The Acton Institute organizes seminars around the world for seminarians representing many Christian denominations. It works to promote understanding of the ethical dimensions of the free market. Today, the Acton Institute employs over 30 people with an annual budget of $6.5 million. Kris graduated with economics and international relations degrees from Johns Hopkins University, and in his role as executive director of the Acton Institute, he has traveled the world, lecturing and consulting in more than a dozen countries. He serves on the boards of the Foundation for Economic Education, the Donors Capital Fund, and Excel Charter Academy. He and his wife, Joni, have 4 children. They live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and are active in St. Thomas the Apostle Church. Now, as panel chairman for Can We Shrink the Federal Bureaucracy, please welcome Kris Mauren.
Good morning, and thank you, Anita, and thank you to Hillsdale and the Durrell Foundation for helping to bring us all here today for really what is a critical national conversation and giving us such a congenial atmosphere to discuss it in. Now, I'm not sure what to make of the fact that this panel is the only one framed around a question and a subset of questions. And indeed, can we shrink the federal bureaucracy? And each speaker will take on a particular department in the federal government with a similar question. Now, I'm sometimes accused of being a pessimist. I consider myself a realist. But I am hoping that the questions posed in this panel are not purely rhetorical. But some cynicism is warranted, for we'll be dealing with the topic of can we eliminate the Department of Energy, Education, and Commerce. And not coincidentally, these are 3 departments that none other than the Gipper, our beloved Ronald Reagan, vowed to abolish. So it's fair to ask, if Ronald Reagan couldn't do it, can it be done? Now, before introducing our panelists, I want to leave you on a hopeful note, which is in short supply today so far. 1 year ago in September, there was an astonishing announcement emanating from the Capitol. The president announced a massive reduction in the size and scope of government, including wholesale elimination of departments in the federal bureaucracy and the firing of nearly 25% of the federal workforce. What? You didn't hear about this? Actually, it's absolutely true. Sadly, however, I wasn't speaking about our president or our country. I was citing Raul Castro of Cuba. And this brings me to my own paraphrasing of today's panel. If Cuba can do it, can we? And lest you think Castro's charge was purely rhetorical, I point you to the latest announcement, really, just 2 weeks ago from Cuba. Castro announced the elimination of the Department of Sugar. Now, really, this is the symbolic and historically practical equivalent of eliminating the government oil ministries of any of the oil producers in the Middle East. It really is hopeful. Okay, so on that hopeful note, let me introduce our panelists. And dealing with the first really controversial question of this panel, do we need the Department of Education? We have none other than Dr. Charles Murray, well-known political science author and libertarian. Now, he first came to national attention in 1984 with the publication of Losing Ground, American Social Policy from 1950 to 1980, which has been fairly credited as the intellectual foundation of the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. And I might say on a personal note, I was at university in the middle 80s, and I became a libertarian in about 86, and your book was one of the very first books I read and had a powerful, formative influence on my life. And if you haven't read Losing Ground, it's as relevant today as it was in 1984, and I commend it to your attention. His 1994 book and bestseller on the New York Times list was The Bell Curve, which sparked a heated controversy for its analysis of the role of IQ in shaping America's class structure. His latest book, Real Education, 4 Simple Truths for Bringing America's Schools Back to Reality, provides a framework for rethinking about what parents should demand of the educational system. Dr. Murray has earned a BA in history at Harvard and holds a PhD in political science from MIT. Now, following Dr. Murray, we'll be addressing the additional vexing question of, is the Department of Energy worth the money? Helping us to dissect that is Jerry Taylor. Jerry Taylor is an acknowledged expert on energy and environmental policy. He's a columnist at Forbes and a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal and National Review. He's written for the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, among others, and is a regular host on CNBC and Bloomberg Radio. Taylor directs the Cato Institute's work on energy and environmental issues. He has served on several congressional advisory bodies and has testified frequently on Capitol Hill on these matters. And finally, we will hear from Ian Murray on the question, abolish the Commerce Department. And actually, I'm seeing his first slide, and there's no question mark, there's an exclamation point. So I'm sorry to ruin the suspense for the rest of you here. Ian Murray is a vice president for strategy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, better known as CEI. He's the author of a best-selling book on environmental policy entitled The Really Inconvenient Truths, and most recently, Stealing You Blind, How Government Fat Cats Are Getting Rich Off of You. He specializes in energy, environment, finance, trade, and science and technology issues. Originally from the UK, Mr. Murray immigrated to the US in 1997 after having worked in a bureaucracy, advising ministers on railroad privatization and the role of private finance in infrastructure reform. So you were one of the good guys there, I guess. Mr. Murray holds a BA and an MA from Oxford and an MBA from the University of London. Please join me in welcoming our entire panelist here. Dr. Murray.
Thank you very much. I just want to begin by saying I think it's appropriate to talk about getting rid of whole departments because there's a kind of bridge we have to get over, I think, in the political dialogue. If we talk about cutting the bureaucracy by 5 or 10%, first, it's not going to happen, and secondly, it misses the point. It's not that the bureaucracies are overstaffed. It is that they are, in many cases, entirely useless, and we can get rid of them altogether. And this is not said from a strict libertarian viewpoint. I think we need to appeal to the American people by saying, look, you don't have to be a libertarian to agree we can get along without this. And let me use the Department of Education as an example. There could be 3 legs on which we say that the Department of Education is justified. One would be its constitutional appropriateness. The other would be that there are problems with education that can only be solved at the federal level. And the third is the track record of the Department of Education and of federal educational efforts since the 1960s. So let me take each of those in turn. Constitutional appropriateness. I am talking to one of the few audiences that we could assemble who I think mostly agree with me on this. At the time of the Constitution, it wasn't just that education was not considered something the federal government should do, it wasn't really considered something that government needed to do at all at any level. But the shakiness of the Department of Education's constitutionality goes far beyond that. There is simply nothing in the Constitution that says that this is something that the Congress has the right to legislate on, except, of course, the Commerce Clause. There is no plausible rationale for using the Commerce Clause to justify federal intervention in education. I'm sure the Supreme Court has found a rationale. I said there is no plausible rationale for it. On a broader level, the American founders had an allegiance to the idea of, it's basically the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, that things should devolve to the lowest possible level at which they can be done. And education is one of those things that parents can do, and individuals acting cooperatively together, let alone something that the government has to do. I would be in favor of abolishing the Department of Education purely on these principled grounds, even if it had been effective. But since those of us who agree on that point are in a very small minority in this country, we have to deal with pragmatic questions. That brings us to the second leg, which is the existence of serious problems that could only be solved at the federal level. The first intervention, major intervention of the federal government in education actually came in 1958 because of Sputnik. And there was at that time a fear, as those of you who are old enough to remember will agree, a real fear that we were falling behind the Soviet Union in these fields. And one of the reasons was that we didn't have nearly enough of our kids going into science and technology. And so the federal government did try to encourage that. And the nature of the motivation is reflected in the title of the act, the National Defense Education Act of 1958. But what really ensnared the federal government in education was the civil rights movement. The Supreme Court had declared segregation of the schools to be unconstitutional in 1954. They did it for the wrong reasons, but it was the right decision. But except for a few highly publicized cases like Little Rock and James Meredith entering the University of Mississippi, not a whole lot changed over the course of the next decade. Was it necessary for the federal government to act? And I think there is a rationale in this case for saying yes. Constitutional rights of large numbers of citizens were being violated. And one of the things that the federal government can legitimately do is enforce the constitutional rights of its citizens. But we saw a very typical story that what would have justified a one-time intervention to ensure the ability of citizens to enjoy their constitutional rights turned into a continuing involvement in education at a broader level. And the reason that happened, once again, has to do with the civil rights movement and minorities. At about the same time that the fight over desegregation was going on, you also had increasing attention being given to the disparities between black and white educational achievement, black and white test scores, and so forth. And it was in the spirit of the times that there would be a strong impulse to do something about that. And there's nothing wrong with the impulse to do something about that. But unfortunately, because of the temper of the times and the coming to power of Lyndon Johnson, who was a massive legislator and with a massive legislative majority in 1964, 65, 66, we got the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 and the Higher Education Act of 1965, and the federal government was in the education business big time. And that then brings us to the third leg. They've been in the education business big time now since about 1965. What does that track record look like? Well, the easiest way to answer that question is through an actually quite good test that is given by the Department of Education. Actually, the National Center for Educational Statistics performs a useful function, I will grant that. And among other things, they do the National Assessment of Educational Progress, called the NAEP, and they administer it to 4th, 8th, and 12th graders periodically, and we have consistent data over the last 30 years, since the 1970s, late 1970s, on math and reading. What's happened? Well, there's some good news. You can see the actual trend lines on this, by the way, in the paper on which my presentation is based. It'll be posted on a website that you'll be told about. But the short story is this. Among 4th graders, you can point to about a 0.2 standard deviation improvement in the scores. How big is 0.2 standard deviations? On an IQ test, that would be 3 points difference. You know, when the mean is 100, not a whole lot. In height, let's say the height of women, a 2.2 standard deviation difference is half an inch. It's not a big increase, but it is an increase. Unfortunately, that was for 4th graders. When you get up to 8th graders and 12th graders, that diminishes. Same thing with reading, only worse. In reading, when you have small gains among 4th graders, 12th graders, reading scores are absolutely flat. And it gets still worse than that, because it starts, these trend lines start in the late 1970s, which was at the absolute bottom of American education. You may know this because you watched SAT scores going down during the last half of the 1960s and the 1970s, or for that matter, you may have had children in school at that point and know that the schools basically became utterly dysfunctional during that period, even more so than they are now. But when we talk about what the trend line has been, we're saying it's been fairly flat, even though we know we were at the bottom at that period. Then the question becomes, well, was there any reason to think that education wasn't getting better before the federal government got involved? And for that, we have a very interesting and unique database that hardly anybody but me knows about it. And one of the reasons I know about it is because I grew up in Iowa, where they gave everybody in Iowa the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. And they started doing that in 1942 and continued doing that until the 1990s. And it wasn't a sample of kids who got this test, everybody in the state did. Now, if you're trying to interpret what's going on in American education, what good is it to look at the single state of Iowa? Well, if you're interested in minority education, it's not very helpful, because up through about 1970, Iowa was 97% non-Latino white. Even now, it's 91% non-Latino white. But if you're asking about actually an uncomplicated trend line, a trend line that's not confused by changing proportions of ethnic groups and so forth, it's really a very strong database. And guess what? From 1942 to about 1967, the test scores of the composite score for 9th graders, I choose 9th graders because there was a big change in the percentage of kids who went all the way through high school during that period. So 9th grade is a better measure for it. Among 9th graders, scores during that period went up by almost a full standard deviation. Now we're not talking something trivial. We were talking on an IQ test, we're talking the difference between an IQ of 100 and an IQ of 115, which is a big deal. So you had major improvements going on throughout the 1950s when the government wasn't doing anything. Federal government wasn't. And from what we know from other data in other states, which don't go back as far, they aren't as complete, but pretty much the same story. Education was improving throughout the United States until about the mid-1960s, when the federal government got involved. It's just too good to be true for people like us who tend to believe in free markets and the government isn't effective, but that's what happened. I won't try to make the causal case, okay? I don't think because we passed the Education Act of 1965, that particularly triggered the downturn. There are lots of other culprits, including the ascendancy of progressive education at about that time. But the basic story is this: we didn't need to get the federal government involved in education in order to improve the quality of education for our kids by all of the longitudinal data that we have available to us. Okay, so you can then turn to a more focused question. Federal government got involved in large part to help the disadvantaged, and especially minorities, to do better by giving money specifically to school systems that had large proportions of disadvantaged and minority kids. That was the whole point of the Title I. Maybe we improved their education. Well, the people who passed the bill genuinely believed we would. And so from the very beginning, the famous Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act had lots of evaluations that were conducted in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and the 1990s. They have been evaluating that thing over and over and over again. Those evaluations have largely been conducted by people who desperately wanted to find good news, okay? And they couldn't. Repeatedly, there has been a failure to find any credible evidence that the efforts of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 had produced a significant positive impact on student achievement. It's once again, it gets even worse than that. If you step back from the formal evaluations and look at the test score gap on the NAEP between high poverty schools, ones with lots of kids living below the poverty line, and low poverty schools, the results are, published in 2001, that this gap grew rather than diminished. From the earliest years, such comparisons have been made, 1986 through 1999. That brings us to No Child Left Behind. Any of you remember No Child Left Behind? Nobody talks about it anymore. It was the law that legislated that by the year 2014, all the children would be above average. I'm dead serious when I say that. They said that all children would be proficient. Well, the percentage of children who were proficient was such that in order for everybody to be proficient, they would all have to become above average by the standard that existed when the law was passed. Nobody talks about it anymore. It failed utterly. It failed utterly for reasons that could have been predicted at the time it was passed, and some of us did predict it, but it's gone. In summary, the long, intrusive role of the federal government in K-12 education doesn't have any credible evidence, I would argue, for a positive effect on American elementary and secondary education. Okay, I will spend just a few brief minutes on higher education. And since we have a number of faculty members in the audience, perhaps I will encounter some opposition to what I'm about to say, but let's go ahead and do it. There's much less agreement on first principles when it comes to college education. Most of us, I think, are working from the same principles in terms of K-12 education, but I have a take on what's been going on with college education that maybe not everyone will share. Namely, that the BA, as it has evolved over the last half century, has become the work of the devil. It is now a substantively meaningless piece of paper, and I mean that literally meaningless if you don't know where the degree was granted and what courses were taken. It's really expensive. I look around the parents and grandparents in this room. We all know how expensive it is. About $7,000 per year in tuition, not including transportation, food, housing, so forth for public universities, and an average of about $27,000 a year for private universities. And yet, this meaningless piece of paper has become the requirement for getting a job interview for millions of jobs, because it's a cost-free way for employers to employ a rough screen for a certain amount of IQ and a certain amount of perseverance if you manage to get the BA. So what happens if you have something that's a minimum requirement for getting the job interview, but it's also true, empirically true, employers don't pay too much attention about grade point average and that. They just want to know if you had the BA. Well, what happens then is that you establish a paper credential that the kids really want to get, but you can get that paper credential by taking the easiest possible courses and doing the least possible work. The result is that you have hundreds of thousands, at least, of students who are attending college not to get an education, but because of a rational desire to get that piece of paper. When the dean of one East Coast college that I'm familiar with is asked how many students are in his institution, he likes to answer, oh, 6 or 7. Unfortunately, what he is saying is too often true. This is not based on horror stories about silly courses that we all know exist in the college catalogs and stories about the trivial study requirements. You can get a BA these days without ever writing a term paper in many universities. And that it's not about the stories about campus binge drinking. It's thoroughly documented in a number of very good books, and this kind of thing affects a large proportion of the kids going to college. The Department of Education is not only implicated in this evolution, it has been the enabler through the huge loan programs and the huge grant programs that it funds, which total about $125 billion in 2010 for loans and $32 billion in grants. Absent this level of intervention, it seems to me quite obvious that over the last 3 decades, we would have seen a much healthier evolution of post-secondary education that focused on concrete job credentials and courses of study that are not constricted by this idiotic 4 years at a residential institution that we have now. And the absence of this artificial intervention also would have led to a lot of market forces that held down costs. Defenders of the Department of Education can unquestionably make the case that they have increased the number of people going to 4-year residential colleges. I view that as part of the Department of Education's indictment, not its defense. Well, what other case might be made for federal involvement in education? Contributions to good educational practice. What has been the positive developments in education the last 20, 30 years? Homeschooling and charter schools, and the government had absolutely zero to do with either one of those except getting in the way of what parents were trying to do to improve the education of their children. If you talk about the important books that have been written or developments improving curriculum and the rest of it, you think of people who have done these things in universities. You think of people like E.D. Hirsch, who's developed a wonderful core knowledge curriculum after he published his landmark book, Cultural Literacy, back in the 1980s. This isn't government stuff. The government spends $200 million a year funding contracts to improve educational practice. You cannot point to any, as far as I'm concerned, that demonstrate an effect. So, I understand that if the Department of Education disappeared tomorrow, it would cause great problems because a lot of schools have become dependent on federal money. And so there would be a lot of readjustments that would have to be made in terms of where the money comes from and how budgets are handled. That much I will grant you. But if you ask what would happen if the Department of Education disappeared tomorrow in terms of the quality of American education, the answer to that question seems to me unambiguously no. Thank you.
Good morning. My topic is whether the Department of Energy is worth the money, and it reminded me of a story that I had heard recently about a woman who went into a bar and she sat down next to a relatively attractive man, and the fellow turned to the bartender and he says, "I'll have one of your specials." And she turned to the man and said, "Well, what's so special about it?" Well, he had a drink and he got up off his stool and he just started flying around the bar. And the woman says, "My gosh, I'll have one of those too." So she got a special. She climbed up on the bar, dove off, broke her arm, cut a few teeth. Bartender turned to the guy and says, "Superman, you're a real jerk when you get all liquored up like that." So what does that have to do with the Department of Energy? Precious nothing. But I figure if you're going to persevere through 20 minutes of agony on the Department of Energy, I'd at least start it out with a joke. The DOE was formed back in 1977. There were 4 reasons listed for the need for this department. One was to address the shortage of non-renewable energy. The second was to address the dependence on foreign energy. The third was the need for a strong national energy program, and the fourth was the need to centralize and better manage all the disparate agencies in the federal government. So in the course of answering the question, is the Department of Energy worth the money, what I'm going to do is ask the question whether the Department of Energy has been successful in addressing the non-renewable energy shortages that allegedly haunt us or our dependence on foreign energy. Is the DOE the best means to address those 2 matters? And are the stated goals or concerns of the DOE worth worrying about in the first place? It probably won't surprise you at all to hear right up front that my conclusions are no, no, and no. First of all, let's look at the alleged increasing shortage of non-renewable energy. Has the DOE succeeded in reducing scarcity? No. If you look at the data, the best metric on scarcity is price. If something's becoming more scarce, it's going to become more expensive. That's the best means by which we can measure whether something's becoming more abundant or more scarce. Well, the weighted average of fossil fuel prices since 1977 on a per BTU basis has actually doubled. So the Department of Energy has not done a very good job alleviating the shortage of non-renewable energy. In fact, non-renewable energy has become far more scarce today than it was when the department was founded. Now, is the DOE the best means of addressing this alleged scarcity? Not really. The DOE can only address scarcity by subsidizing research and development for fossil fuels and non-fossil fuel substitutes, and by promoting energy efficiency standards. That's how the DOE tries to address this problem. You might say, well, the federal government can increase drilling on federal lands, and yes, it can, but that's the Department of Interior. That's not the Department of Energy. So as far as trying to increase supply through R&D, what's the track record? Well, as we've seen, energy is becoming more scarce, not more abundant, so it's not very good, but the R&D literature itself is very dense and conflicting. Without getting bogged down in it, we can say, however, a couple of things with some certainty. First, the DOE's large-scale demonstration programs and big-budget R&D projects have been miserable failures. Think fusion, think synthetic fuels. Lately, Solyndra is another example of an ongoing multi-decade boondoggle for wind and solar energy. DOE has produced nothing of consequence in their big-budget projects. The alleged DOE success stories that are trotted out by proponents are very poorly documented anecdotes. The Governmental Accountability Office did an analysis of the 50 leading success stories trotted out by the department for how wonderful their R&D has been, and they concluded it was so riddled with mathematical errors, logical leaps, and all sorts of problems in the analysis that it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And that was the GAO's conclusion. Third, we find there's no correlation at all between publicly funded energy R&D and improvements in energy efficiency or reductions in the carbon intensity of the energy sector. It doesn't matter how much we spend on R&D, things don't seem to improve on those scores. Moreover, there's no correlation between energy efficiency standards and improvements in energy efficiency in the economy. If you look at data regarding the amount of energy necessary to produce a unit of GDP, you'll find that over time it improves at a very steady pace. It doesn't matter how much we're spending on R&D at the federal or state level. It doesn't even matter where energy prices are. There are very steady, constant gains in energy efficiency that seem completely invulnerable to public policy stimuli. So is the DOE the best means to address these shortages? I would say no. The best means to increase the supply of non-renewable energy is to, of course, lower taxes on private production and to facilitate the production of non-renewable energy on federal lands. The IRS can do the former, the Department of Interior can do the latter. There's no room for the DOE here. The best means to reduce demand for non-renewable energy, if that's something we want the government to do, is to tax the heck out of non-renewable energy. And of course, that's something that the DOE wouldn't do. That's something the IRS would do. The best means to address market failures in research and development is to make all R&D somewhat more attractive to private investors. If you look at the literature and you read the accounts for economists for why the government needs to be involved in R&D, they tell a very straightforward story. People who invest in R&D and come up with successful innovations or technologies can't fully capture the benefits of what they've created. Other people are going to capture some of those benefits, and so private actors are going to invest suboptimally in R&D. All right, if that bothers you, if you think that's a significant enough problem, then the correct remedy is to make all investment in R&D somewhat more attractive, maybe by a refundable R&D tax credit or something of the kind. The criticism is not that people in the private sector are too stupid to know what to invest in. It's not that they can't read accounting sheets. It's not that they are blind to certain kinds of R&D projects. It's that they have a general lack of incentive to invest optimally. That would be the correct way to address this market failure, not through targeted R&D programs subject to political decision-making and all the other public choice problems we find when the government gets involved in things. So, is scarcity, all that having been said, worth worrying about in the first place, however? Again, probably not. The market does not fail to respond to scarcity. Price signals adjust very rapidly to changes in supply and demand, and they adjust robustly, and consumers respond efficiently. The complaints by the consumer advocates are not, believe me, that the price mechanisms don't work very well when scarcity occurs. They work very, very well, which is why prices in oil and gas and electricity can move greatly and also affect consumer behavior very greatly. That's why people scream and ask for government to protect them from these price signals. The market doesn't fail to address scarcity. And although fossil fuel prices have increased since 1977, as I mentioned, it's really unclear whether there's any long-term trend here that suggests really physical scarcity is in play. For instance, let's look at oil. Let's look at each of the non-renewables in turn. First, when it comes to oil prices. Professor James Hamilton of UC California, San Diego, undertook a very interesting investigation where he examined quarterly oil price data from the first quarter of 1970 through the first quarter of 2008. And here's what he found. Although prices increased by 172% over the sample period, or an average of 1.12% per quarter, Hamilton could not reject the null hypothesis that there was no trend at all in this data. Secondly, the data is most consistent with the observation that oil prices move akin to, quote, a random walk without drift. And third, the best predictor of future price, according to Hamilton, is present price. So given those conclusions, it's not altogether clear that oil is increasingly scarce. Let's look at natural gas. Hydraulic fracking has radically altered the picture in natural gas markets and expectations about future supply. Futures markets point towards very stable natural gas prices over the next 9 years, and commodity price forecasters expect gas to increase only modestly in price through 2021. We certainly do not face the kind of scarcities in natural gas that many people believe. And when it comes to coal, well, the very abundance of coal is why environmentalists are worried about climate change. We're not running short of coal. So it's not entirely clear to me there is a problem to be addressed, and even if there were, markets can respond very well to changes in supply and demand. What about the dependence on foreign energy? Has the DOE succeeded here? Once again, no. In 1977, 47% of the energy we consumed in this country came from foreign suppliers. In 2009, that figure stood at 52%. So the Department of Energy failed to do much here. Now, one might argue, and in fact, if you're paid by the Obama administration, you would argue, that the market share for imported energy would be even greater were it not for the wonderful DOE. But that's difficult to believe. The primary energy import of consequence here is crude oil. We don't import much natural gas or coal. Crude oil is imported because it's cheaper at the margin than producing crude from domestic suppliers, buying crude from domestic suppliers. And DOE has done absolutely nothing to reduce the cost of domestic crude oil production. And in fact, there's very little it could do in that regard anyway. Is the DOE the best means to address oil dependence? No. The most direct and efficient answer, as far as oil dependence is concerned, if we want to address it, is to tax oil imports. Very direct and very effective manner. The heavier the tax, the more we'll reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Reducing dependence on foreign oil, however, I should note, is in direct opposition to the goal of alleviating the shortage of non-renewable energy. If we're going to restrict imports in this country, we are by definition going to restrict supply. We're going to make it more scarce. This is another example where government is both hitting the accelerator and hitting the brake at the same time. But should we worry about our reliance on foreign oil? I know many of you in the audience probably think we should. I think you're wrong. I don't think this is worth wasting any sleep on over at all. First of all, we hear that our reliance on foreign oil means that we need to trade blood for oil, that we need to defend these regimes in the Middle East because they're vital suppliers, and it leads us into war. Well, the problem here is that oil producers will certainly pay for their own security needs as long as doing so results in greater profits than equivalent investments in some other thing. Given the fact that oil producers only have oil to sell on the market, it's for the most part their most valuable commodity. Without it, their economies fall apart. part, the idea if the United States weren't defending oil production facilities, pipelines, or shipping lanes, that nobody would is silly. People, of course, would. The idea that the Saudis or other oil producers can't defend their oil infrastructure is likewise silly. The Saudis and other Middle Eastern governments paid for 55% of the first Gulf War. They certainly have the money to spend if they want to spend it. The best way to look at our involvement in the Middle East to protect foreign oil producers is as a gift. It is a welfare project for producers abroad. You might support or oppose that welfare project, but it's certainly not a necessary welfare project. Now, others argue, well, maybe we don't have to defend them, but we have to kiss their rings. I was on a Kris Matthews show, and he says, but, you know, isn't this reliance on foreign oil means we have to go bow down and kiss the rings of the Saudis to get their crude? Well, no. Friendly relations with oil producers neither enhance access to imported crude oil nor lower its price. Oil producers are profit maximizers, period, full stop, and end of story. They are interested in a dollar. Notice that Hugo Chavez is happy to sell us all the crude we'll buy. And the former friends we had in Iran and the Shah was one of the biggest price hawks in the OPEC nation, in the OPEC world. Making friends with producers doesn't change their calculation at all. This isn't just my casual observance of this. If you picked up one of the best books on the subject, it's Maury Edelman's book, Genie Out of the Bottle, World Oil Since 1970. Edelman was once still is, probably the most prominent oil economist in the world. He argued, quote, we look in vain for an example of a government that deliberately avoids a higher income. The self-serving declaration of an interested party is not evidence. Moreover, oil independence is pointless. Even if you think I'm wrong about this, even if all of our oil came from Texas and Alaska, a supply disruption abroad, whether it's because of planned cutback or a terrorist attack or something like that, is going to increase the price of crude oil everywhere, no matter where it's produced. A great example of this is Great Britain. Until recently, Great Britain was energy independent, got all the oil it needed from the North Sea, but the supply disruption in 1978 when the Shah of Iran fell had as big an impact in Great Britain as it did in Japan, which was entirely dependent on foreign crude. So the idea that oil independence, getting all of our supplies from domestic sources, protects us from international oil shocks is the gibberish of a crazy man. What about embargoes? Embargoes, too, are complete phantasms. In 1973, during the Arab oil embargo, all that occurred is instead of buying oil from Arab members of OPEC, we bought oil from people who bought oil from Arab members of OPEC, or played a game of musical chairs in which we bought from non-OPEC producers. We displaced their old clients then went to OPEC producers. There was absolutely no reduction in oil imports in 1973 at all. The main reason for this is that oil is a fungible commodity. Once oil is produced and put on the market, the producer doesn't decide where it goes. Middlemen decide where it goes, right? It's the same reason why in 1979, those of you who are old enough to remember this, remember that Jimmy Carter imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union for the invasion of Afghanistan. It wasn't more than a month until the newspapers were full of stories about how U.S. grain was still finding its way into the Soviet Union. How was that? Once U.S. grain's on the market, it's not up to President Carter where it goes. It goes where the market wants to put it, and it ended up in the Soviet Union. So embargoes are complete phantasms. We don't have to worry about them at all. So where does all this leave us? Well, do we then need a comprehensive national energy strategy? Republicans tell us this all the time. Their big complaint is that the president isn't intervening aggressively enough in energy markets to suit their taste. Well, to what end? What exactly is the market failure in the energy sector that demands such micromanagement? Well, there's no scarcity problem, as we discussed, that needs to be addressed. Reliance on foreign oil is not a problem that needs to be addressed, and one the U.S. government couldn't do much to address anyway. There's just simply no market failure here that is particularly interesting. Only one jumps out at me, which is the environmental externalities associated with energy consumption. The argument here is that since the consumer doesn't pay for all of the environmental damages that are associated with his energy consumption, his or her energy consumption, prices are too low and overconsumption results. Now, this is a debatable point, but let's posit that it's correct for the sake of this conversation. What's the correct remedy for that market failure? Well, it certainly isn't a Department of Energy to promote all kinds of research and development, which hasn't panned out anyway. The most direct way to address this, if we want to address it, is to tax pollution. Now, the reason we don't tax pollution, of course, it's a very transparent cost consumers don't like to pay, and so what we do is we regulate emissions instead. The idea with regulation is to try to approximate a world that would exist if polluters had to pay the polluted for the damages that they cause or for the rights to continue polluting, and the result would be a certain level of emissions. Regulation attempts to get us there. So if we have an issue with uninternalized externalities in the environmental realm, and we don't have the the political courage to actually tax the emissions that we're worried about directly, we can increase regulations indirectly. Notice this is a job for the EPA, not the Department of Energy. We might also concern ourselves a bit with uncompetitive nature of certain energy markets. It used to be we worried about the big oil companies and the Seven Sisters. Now they control the world oil market. And in 1967 and 68, those arguments had some legs. Today, big oil, as we know it, which are the privately owned integrated oil companies like Exxon, BP, Shell, and others, constitute all of about 8 or 9% of the world crude oil market. That's their market share. The market share in the crude oil market of today is largely dominated by foreign-owned oil companies like Saudi Aramco and others. So the idea that we need to worry about the uncompetitive nature of oil markets, again, is the gibberings of somebody who's been cryogenically frozen since 1967. The world doesn't work that way anymore. Electricity markets are arguably uncompetitive in certain ways. In fact, I think you make a fairly good case that left to their own, electricity markets would lead to some sort of, if not natural monopoly, then it would be very difficult to find entry to compete with some of them. But notice this is a state issue. We have state regulatory agencies to deal with that sort of thing. Just for the record, we're the Cato Institute. We don't like that either. But the point is, if you are worried about that, and you shouldn't be, but if you are, you don't need a Department of Energy for that activity either. The conclusion I want to leave with you is that energy really is no different from any other commodity in the marketplace. There is no BTU exception found in the arguments for it in the Wealth of Nations. We don't need a Department of Energy any more than we need a Department of Textiles, a Department of Computer Chips, or a Department of anything else. Now, the question, the panel, of course, I was asked to address the question of whether the money we spend on the Department of Energy is worth the money, and of course, I say no. But the broader question is, can we get rid of the Department of Energy? Told you whether we should, but can we? The problem we have here is that consumers and voters demand those magic drinks at the bar that will solve problems for them. See how I loop back to that bad joke? I'm a highly paid speaker. I really know my craft. But the reality is that the public wants the government to do something about really annoying massive shifts in energy prices. One of the reasons why gasoline prices can go skyrocketing over a minor story like a strike in Nigeria or a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, or any number of small stimuli can send prices skyrocketing is because demand is relatively inelastic in the short run. It's a little bit more elastic in the long run, but the fact is, given that demand is somewhat inelastic in the short run, it's no surprise to you, as people who all drive cars, that it takes a real big increase in gasoline prices to get you to drive less, even just a little bit less. And that's the reason it takes massive price increases to balance the market after there's been even minor interruptions in supply. The volatility and inelasticity demand in the electricity sector is equally great and equally problematic. Because of that, consumers run to the government and ask for protection because they don't like to get faced with these kinds of high prices. And producers, of course, do the same thing. Right now, of course, we're in a boom cycle where everyone's complaining about high price, but in the mid-1980s, producers were screaming about low price. And Don Hedel, then the Secretary of the Interior, after he left the Reagan administration, wrote a book about the horrible collapse of oil markets and how OPEC was flooding the market with crude oil and how we wanted federal laws to do that. And the federal government had to protect producers and give them subsidies because it works the other way around as well. When demand drops even a little bit, prices are going to collapse in oil markets. And so producers look for government protection. So the question of can we get rid of the Department of Energy is really a question of can we quit looking for the government to produce magical solutions and to cater to consumers and producers to protect them against gyrations in energy markets that are endogenous and natural. They're not examples of market failure. They just happen to be unpleasant. I would like to think that we can do this, but I wait to be convinced. Anyway, thank you for your time.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you don't mind hearing from another British accent today. I cannot promise to be as articulate as my old friend Daniel Hannan, but I hope I can bring you some insights from across the pond in addition to his. Charles and Jerry have told you the whys of abolishing the departments they refer to. I'm going to concentrate primarily on the how, so my presentation will be a little bit different. But I will start with some justification for the plan I'm about to present to you, as if David Henderson's talk this morning did not give us reason enough. The Department of Commerce's mission statement is a charter for government interference in markets. It employs 47,000 people directly and spends about $9 billion annually on its mission, and I quote, to promote job creation, economic growth, sustainable development, and improved standards of living for all Americans by working in partnership with businesses, universities, communities, and our nation's workers. What this means in practice is that the department exists to reward businesses for following its favored policies. It provides bailouts, handouts, and the spoils of redistribution. In some ways, just as the Department of Labor is the government arm of the labor unions, so the Department of Commerce is the government arm of rent-seeking businesses. This alone should be reason for advancing its elimination. But let us take the department at its word. All of the purposes of the department, as laid out in its mission statement, job creation, economic growth, improved standards of living, even sustainable development, are things that happen on their own in the general functioning of markets. To imagine that a government department can do better than markets at providing all these benefits is to fall prey to what Hayek called the fatal conceit. I know of no better expression of the fatal conceit than that coined by Douglas Jay, later, despite being a socialist, Lord Jay, the man who brought the thinking of John Maynard Keynes into the British Labour Party. In 1937, he wrote that, in some cases, the gentleman in Whitehall, that's the centre of British administration, really does know better what is good for people than the people know themselves. This sentence was the foundation of the British planned economy that governed the country from 1945 to 1979, and which led one of the greatest nations on earth down a path to where it became the sick man of Europe. It is indeed to Whitehall that I shall turn for inspiration in assessing what to do with the Department of Commerce, not, however, to the Whitehall of Douglas Jay, but to the Whitehall of Margaret Thatcher. That redoubtable lady realized just how much of a burden over-centralized government had become on her nation. And as Prime Minister, she pushed through a series of public sector reforms that provide a model for rethinking American government. As an example, when I started working for the British Department of Transport straight out of university in 1989, it had some 14,000 employees. So, proportionate to population was about the same size as commerce here. By a variety of means and reforms, by the time I left after privatizing myself out of a job in 1996, Mrs. T and her successor, John Major, had reduced that number to a policy core of just 2,000. Even though the subsequent Labour government has vastly increased the size of government overall in the UK through new programmes, agencies and regulations, that number has not changed, demonstrating the resiliency of these reforms. As I outline what I suggest we should do with the Department of Commerce, I shall make reference to these reforms throughout this speech. Where to start? Well, if the Cabinet was a news bureau, with the Secretary of Treasury the economics correspondent, the Secretary of State the foreign correspondent, and the Secretary of Defense the war correspondent, the Secretary of Commerce would be the weatherman. I mean this quite seriously, because the single biggest agency in commerce outside of census years is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which houses the National Weather Service. NOAA soaks up about $5 billion of the department's $8 billion budget. NOAA is actually a strange hybrid of NASA and the EPA, and like the EPA, was born of President Nixon's departmental reorganization in 1970. Nixon said it was needed, I quote, for better protection of life and property from natural hazards, for a better understanding of the total environment, and for exploration and development leading to the intelligent use of our marine resources. NOAA today boasts that it is a provider of environmental information services, a provider of environmental stewardship services, and a leader in applied scientific research. Again, each of these is a function that could be provided privately, and which is probably worse for being provided publicly. NOAA today consists of 6 main offices: the aforementioned National Weather Service, the National Ocean Service, the Office of Oceanic Atmospheric Research, the National Environmental Satellite Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and the Office of Marine and Aviation Operations. Together, they form a colossal operation that has become one of the main drivers of the climate change industry, and as such has become harmful to the US Commonwealth. Indeed, its mission to understand and predict changes in the Earth's environment and conserve and manage coastal and marine resources to meet our nation's economic, social, and environmental needs, with its emphasis on prediction and management, seems designed around the fatal conceit. That is not to say that NOAA as a whole is useless, but its organization is such that it corrupts the useful functions. It needs to be broken up. So first, I suggest that the National Weather Service be broken away from the department with a view to eventual privatization. When I first suggested the privatization of the National Weather Service during Hurricane Irene, I was met with a barrage of criticism such as I have never previously encountered, even in almost 10 years of dealing primarily with global warming, which, as Cherry knows, is not an uncontroversial subject. There is a level of visceral hostility to the idea of privatizing weather forecasts and warnings that astonished me. Yet we live every day with the weather forecasts and warnings provided by local radio stations and college campuses being sourced not from the NWS, but from private companies such as AccuWeather. Repeated studies have actually found that the forecasts and warnings provided by these private companies are more accurate and reliable than those provided by the NWS. Indeed, those private weather services are themselves a result of a gradual privatization of the government's weather functions. In the past, the NWS has provided radio bulletins and even written the weather forecasts for local newspapers. We do not think it necessary for the NWS to do that today. And as I just mentioned, this privatization process has improved the quality of the forecasts. The most frequent argument I heard against privatization was that the NWS provides the data that the private companies used, as if by suggesting privatization, I was advocating the dismantlement of data-gathering services. Does the advocate of air traffic control privatization want to abolish the air traffic control system? When I worked on the privatization of British Rail, did I want to rip up the tracks? Of course not. The idea that privatizing the NWS would lead to the end of data gathering is facile. The goal of privatization is to improve services, not, for the most part, to abolish them, by making them more responsive to change and innovation, while removing the burden of their upkeep from taxpayers and placing it on its customers. In a sense, the NWS is currently a taxpayer subsidy to AccuWeather, the Weather Channel, and others. So the best way to handle the privatization of the NWS, I believe, is to move it first to what the UK privatizations call trading fund status. The NWS, which has a valuable product, should charge for that product to cover its costs. With multiple competing radio, TV, and print outlets demanding its products, never mind the other interests like companies such as Amazon that rely on just-in-time delivery and have a keen interest in what the weather is going to be like, the charge for its services would probably be small change for these operations and no cost to the casual consumer like you and I. The taxpayer would be better off by $1 billion a year. Once the service has achieved trading fund status, the next step is full privatization. The service could be privatized as a single enterprise or by being broken up. It could be sold to existing companies, like AccuWeather, to startups or management buyouts, or sold to shareholders as a single body by IPO. All these arrangements have proved successful in multiple privatizations around the world. The exact form of privatization would be decided as a result of the move to trading fund status, which would help identify clearly where the profit and cost centers of the operation lay. Privatizations generally lead to significant increases in investment and infrastructure spending, so the product that we all rely on would surely be improved. Not least, we might have a more accurate idea of whether or not we'll need an umbrella when we leave the house. I should note here that there will be little or no national security implications. The armed services all have their own weather functions. What security issues there may remain can be dealt with in the move to trading fund status. There are some odd rules that prevent, for example, private operation of weather radar. These are almost certainly antiquated and can be revised with appropriate consideration given to defense and air traffic control concerns. Finally, there is the question of what to do with organizations like the National Hurricane Center that do some very specialized and valuable research, such as flying aircraft into hurricanes. For these organizations, I suggest an alternative form of privatization, which was used, for example, in the privatization of the Building Research Establishment and similar scientific organizations in the UK. The BRE was privatized as a charitable trust rather than as a for-profit body. and has become since one of the world's leading research-led consultancies on innovation, risk, and sustainability with business worldwide. I would suggest that certain industries, such as the insurance industry, would have a keen interest in the success of such a charitable body and would become major funders. The other main weather-related function of NOAA is the National Environmental Satellite Service. This operates several satellites and collects data from military and civilian services, both domestic and international. These civilian-operated satellites could easily be managed by private entities. I receive my TV service from a satellite managed by a private entity, and could be privatized as a company either owned by all the new weather companies combined or as a charitable trust. The various data centers provide an academic function and are used by academics internationally. They would be more appropriately funded and run by academic bodies and should therefore be transferred to universities. The prestige of housing such bodies as the National Snow and Ice Data Center should be attractive enough to universities to be able to secure funding to run them. The National Ocean Service is largely a survey organization. Its various survey functions could be transferred to the US Coast Guard and the US Geological Survey, which could be renamed the US Survey Organization or something like that. The national marine sanctuaries and other oceanic resources could and should be privatized by sale. Similarly, the management of fisheries is best left not to bureaucrats, but to fishermen who have a direct ownership stake in the health of the fisheries. Where fisheries have been genuinely privatized, such as in New Zealand, with the fishermen's property rights guaranteed, fish stocks have rebounded along with the fishermen's profits. So much for the National Marine Fisheries Service. They can organize the privatization of the fisheries and bow out gracefully. The Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research provides the theoretical science, as opposed to the applied science of the National Hurricane Center and the like. It consists mainly of 7 research laboratories. Where appropriate, these should be merged with the applied science versions and privatized as charitable trusts. To those who are skeptical that a research laboratory could be privatized, I point you to the laboratory of the government chemist in the UK. On privatization, LGC, as it is now called, had a turnover of 15 million British pounds and a staff of 270. It now has a turnover of 130 million pounds and a staff of 1,300. It has successfully acquired several European laboratories and is a world leader in analytical chemistry. Like it or not, the environmental business is here to stay because of consumer demand. There is no reason why environmental laboratories cannot be privatized. The Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, which provides the ships and planes used by NOAA agencies, should obviously be broken up and its assets reassigned during this privatization process. There will doubtless be many residual functions left over after this process. These functions can be transferred to the EPA or NASA if they are still felt appropriate and Congress is unwilling to terminate them. Next up is the Census Bureau. Unlike NOAA, the Census has a genuine constitutional role, but its functions are today well in excess of its constitutional requirements. The Census Bureau should really concentrate on its mission of keeping track of the headcount for congressional apportionment and abandon its accumulated functions of asking more and more intrusive questions, which are normally used to redistribute wealth along demographic lines or provide free market research for business. I am open to the idea of the Census Bureau being merged with all the various statistical agencies of the US government, such as the Bureau of Economic Analysis, also in the Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Center for Education Statistics, as Charles mentioned, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Many of these provide important indicators, such as the murder rate, unemployment levels, or inflation indices, that provide important information that help guide appropriate policy. Such an agency would probably provide good value for the money to the taxpayer if managed effectively. At any event, it would be a low priority for privatization. Similarly, the Patent Office has a valid constitutional function, albeit one that I regard as ill-founded. It would be a prime candidate for separation from the department and re-establishment as a performance-based organization. These are the American equivalents of the Thatcherite Next Steps executive agencies, which sought to establish the service delivery functions of government on grounds that achieved high levels of consumer service while providing good value for money to the taxpayer, neither of which is a virtue of traditional bureaucracy. PBOs were such a good idea that they were fiercely resisted by the Washington establishment. As such, only one has been set up since their announcement by Vice President Gore, of all people. The Patent Office would be an excellent candidate for restarting this experiment, given its massive backlog in clearing patent applications. The current head of the USPTO is an IP lawyer, not a manager. A PBO would have a genuine manager as its head, Of course, in the absence of a Secretary of Commerce, it would need to be housed somewhere for budget purposes. I would suggest that all PBOs be transferred to the Executive Office of the President or the Office of Management and Budget, because that is what they are there for, managing budgets effectively. I also imagine that a PBO PTO, if you pardon the expression, would cover its own costs quite quickly. Next up is the National Institute of Science and Technology, of Standards and Technology, with a $1 billion budget. In some ways, the NIST is one of the oldest centralizing agencies there is, dating back to George Washington's demands for standardized weights and measures. The boy wonder Herbert Hoover, ever the engineer, used its predecessor to standardize tool sizes across the US, although his successors were less effective when they tried to impose the metric system, thank the Lord. Again, most of NIST is research laboratories, which can be privatized along the lines described earlier. Where necessary, the privatized laboratories can retain statutory roles. This is common in the privatized laboratories in the UK and elsewhere. And it is revealing when you look at the list of delegates to the committees of the Système International and the like. Most countries' representatives are academics or even private individuals. Only the Americans these days, since the fall of the Soviet Union, are bureaucrats. Moving swiftly on, we come to the International Trade Administration. For the most part, the ITA organizes trade junkets and enforces anti-dumping regulations, which are a form of protectionism. It is no wonder that, particularly under the Clinton administration, the Office of Secretary of Commerce was sought after by party fundraisers. These functions should simply be abolished by Congress. Those functions that Congress is unwilling or unable to do away with, probably most likely related to international treaties, should be transferred to the US Trade Representative. Abolishing this office would save taxpayers $500 million a year. The same fate should befall the department's permanent stimulus programs, the Economic Development Administration and the Minority Business Development Administration. The EDA regularly wastes taxpayer money, promoting projects that no one in their right mind would pursue, like the Cedar Rapids, Iowa Convention Center that it is backing to the tune of $35 million, which will lose $1.3 million annually, according to the city's own estimate. In another case, the EDA attracted a new warehouse to Visalia, California, to create 250 jobs. The firm that took the EDA's $2 million grant promptly closed its warehouse in Brisbane, California, shedding 313 jobs in the process. The MBDA does the same sort of thing, except on racial grounds, and so is doubly offensive. Should there be anything worth saving from the deserved wreckage of these offices, and I doubt it, those functions can be transferred to the Small Business Administration. These abolitions would save $357 million. Finally, the department also houses its own very own branch of the Homeland Security apparatus, the sinisterly named Bureau of Industry and Security, which is charged with, for example, using export controls to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Again, such functions would be better off housed in the US Trade Representative or Department of Homeland Security. And finally, there is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which manages the federal use of the electromagnetic spectrum. These functions could be easily transferred to the General Services Administration, while other functions, such as auctioning spectrum, could go to the Department of Treasury or OMB, and others, like the grants for promoting children's educational television, should be simply abolished. This is a brief overview of how we could accomplish the outright abolition of an entire government department. The process of abolition should be overseen by the Office of Management and Budget, as was foreseen in a bill to abolish the department passed by Congress in 1995, but vetoed by President Clinton. Yes, Congress has already abolished the department once. So with the right Congress and with the right president, it can be done. There is hope. One final word. The department's palatial headquarters in Federal Triangle would make a magnificent hotel. And it even has its own tourist attraction in the basement, the National Aquarium. That was privatized in 1982.
Thank you, gentlemen, for those very insightful, non-gibbering presentations. And thank you, too, for staying on time, which allows us to go forward with some questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Microphones will find you, and tell us to whom you are addressing your question. I see one in the far back.
Question for Charles Murray. You mentioned that Employers are only concerned with whether a candidate has that piece of paper and not particularly concerned with what the student has learned. To what extent would you say that that phenomenon has grown because of the Supreme Court's disparate impact jurisprudence, which makes it almost a crime, or at least a very dangerous thing, to test people for knowledge and abilities and skills and so on?
That Supreme Court decision, and you're quite right, it's really tough to test people, has been absolutely crucial in creating the artificial value of the BA. The problem is that the solution to the artificiality of the BA, in my view, is certification rather than degrees. So that if you want to go into a job in business, you shouldn't be locked into being a business administration major for 4 years. You should be able to go take the college level courses that you want to take to learn about marketing or accounting or the rest of it, and then be able to take a test. And it wouldn't have to be just a paper and pencil test. There could be work products too. You know, I'm not limiting to that. A test that you could take to an employer to demonstrate what you know. I think that this kind of thing has actually potential even despite the Supreme Court's decision. You know, we still have the CPA test, Certified Public Accountant test, which is used. We have lots of other certification tests that are used. And as long as you can demonstrate that these actually have relevance to the job requirements, I don't want to you can get away with using those tests. You still have things you have to worry about with racial disparate impact, but you can get away with those. So, point number one, Supreme Court decision, incredibly problematic in terms of artificially inflating the importance of the BA. There are ways that people can use concrete credentials much more meaningful than the BA, despite that Supreme Court decision.
Right up front here.
I asked a similar question to this, the one I'm ready to ask now, 3 years ago at this same meeting, and it relates to energy. We along this row are all Midwest farmers, and where our farms are, we have coal under the ground. We're currently producing food, ethanol, and biodiesel. We have windmills adjacent, or practically on our land, not directly on any of our land, but threatening. And what's the other energy source? Coal under the ground. Now my question is, with policy going the way that it is, energy policy, how much control over our own property and own resources are we going to have immediately and over the long haul? Will the government be intervening in such a way that we no longer can even respond to a market, because the markets will be totally controlled in those areas, and we may be forced to produce the coal as opposed to one of the other resources?
Thank you. I'll let Jerry take the first stab at that.
Well, do bear in mind that a couple of the energy sources that you mentioned that are being produced in the Midwest, wind and ethanol, are being produced entirely because of massive government subsidy. Absent those subsidies, they wouldn't be produced in the Midwest. So the government can create energy sources and it can strangle energy sources. When it comes to coal on private lands, there are environmental regulations associated with mining, but those regulations are not so onerous that it prevents mining operations in either eastern Appalachia or in western parts of the United States. The reason you don't see a lot of mining for coal in the Midwest, where presently it doesn't exist, is the economics just simply aren't there. You do see mining in Ohio and Kentucky and other parts of the Midwest where the economics are favorable, but where the deposits aren't favorable, you're not seeing it. One of the reasons for that, by the way, is the fact that with natural gas prices as low as they are today, it's almost everything at the margins being built as gas-fired generation. About 95% 5 or 6% of new generating capacity built in this country over the last 15 or 20 years has been gas-fired, not coal-fired, not nuclear, not renewable, but gas. Gas has a lot of advantages relative to coal. I won't get into them right now, but that's not entirely a phenomena associated with government intervention. There are just a lot of good reasons why the industry is moving towards gas at the margin. Putting on looking at a crystal ball and asking what public policy will be down the road, will the government prevent energy extraction on private lands in the future? Well, to the extent to which they regulate that activity with costly standards, it can, of course, price you out of a market. So they say, well, you can, mine on private land, but if you can't pay the regulatory costs given the market to make it profitable, that's not going to happen. My own sense of it is that the public is far more concerned about high energy prices than they are about environmental consequences of energy production. I think we're going to see that play out in the fracking debate, where you've got natural gas deposits. So my sense of it is that in the long haul, the government, even though environmentalists may want to prompt the government to restrict energy production on private lands when it comes to gas or maybe coal down the road, I don't think they're going to succeed very well. At the end of the day, I think most voters would shoot their own grandmother to get about 10 cents off a gallon of gasoline.
All right, this gentleman in the front row.
In 1965, during the Johnson administration, remember Head Start was a great thing that was going to save elementary school. Do you know of any data, Dr. Murray, that after 4 years, do the people who weren't in Head Start have any different from the people who were in Head Start? It's a very expensive program.
Yeah, Head Start has been evaluated. You literally have shelves of evaluations of Head Start. And when you have that many evaluations, you have people that look at the elephant from a variety of different ways. So let me make a couple of comments. One is, I think it is a fair characterization of the literature to say that the average Head Start program, there is no evidence that you have retained value from that at all. Then you say, well, what about really good Head Starts? And here some of you may have heard of a thing called Preschool. The reason some of you may have heard of it is because it is one of the only success stories out there, and guess what? If you have 1,000 failures and one success story, which one gets on the CBS Evening News? Preschool was an extremely intensive preschool program. It was like Head Start on steroids. It was Head Start with a staff ratio of highly trained people, like 1 per 3 children. I don't know it was extremely intensive, something we couldn't conceivably afford. And there is evidence that it provided sustained positive impacts that lasted into adulthood, not transformative ones. We're not talking about disadvantaged kids who went out and graduated from Harvard Law School. We're talking about a crime rate that is really high, but not quite as high as the crime rate of similar kids who don't get that. So here, I think, is where we stand on this issue. A massive program like Head Start will have no permanent effects on cognitive ability, will have no permanent effects on school achievement, nor on the likelihood of unemployment. It is possible that very, very intensive programs, preschool programs, can have some of those effects. They are not programs that we can afford to do. So given that set of circumstances, here's the way I look at something like Head Start. And now I'm not talking as a libertarian, I'm talking as a parent and who is concerned about other children. If you have children who are in extremely deprived environments, they're living in homes where the mother doesn't talk to them, where there is no father, perhaps there's abuse, perhaps there's chaos. If we have a way to provide some hours during the day in which those children are in a safe, warm, nurturing environment, I don't really care if their school achievement 10 years from now is improved. We have done something good for those children. And I, as a taxpayer and a libertarian, will say, if you are doing that, if that's what the money is being used for, then I'm willing to pay the taxes. But then you get to the issue of that's not what most Head Start places are like, and those are not the children they're serving. It's like so many other things involved with programs that appeal to us as individuals because what they are trying to do is really good. And the problem is that the best way to provide those is not through a massive Head Start. The best way to provide those is through churches, through local organizations, through neighborhoods of parents and communities. And all of those things are precisely the institutions that are innervated by the programs like Head Start that are trying to do good things. I have just put in a period of about a minute and a half or 2 minutes something that I've written entire books on, so you'll excuse it if I haven't filled in all the bits and pieces on that.
Right here in the middle.
I have a question on education. I'm Kwa from Sterling College in Kansas. I was born and raised in Singapore, but I'm a US citizen. I got my higher education in US. I think the freedom that we enjoy here, based on the liberty of Christ, I think is tremendous. And when we free up this freedom, I think we produce the most Nobel Prize laureate against any nation. We produce the most innovation against any nation. And we can produce people like Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, but at the same time, we can produce people like Jeffrey Skilling of Enron, and also Madoff. So what kind of education or system of education would you encourage to promote Nobel Prize laureate Steve Jobs, the kind of independent thinking, and not Jeffrey Skilling or Madoff?
Well, Steve Jobs lasted precisely 1 semester at Reed College. What's that? It lasted 1 semester at Reed College. So, I think that what produces the innovation and the creativity ultimately is the atmosphere in which, if you have a great idea, you can go out and run with it. And I think that it is that atmosphere, much more than any specifics about our educational system, which has been the biggest thing that the United States has had going for it. If you come to the United States, you can you can invent electronic devices that don't ring when other people are speaking. Okay, I think we're taken care of now. So I don't think the educational system itself is the solution there. The way I want to recast the educational objectives of this country, it goes as follows. Right now, what we do is we say, you either grow up to be a person with a BA, which doesn't give you a whole lot of prestige these days, but the other kind of person is the person who's just a high school graduate. And it is correct that in today's culture, they are perceived in many important ways as second-class citizens, absolutely needlessly. Suppose we recast the whole system of education and its goals as follows. The purpose of education has succeeded if a child grows to adulthood having discovered something he or she loves to do and having learned how to do it well. That's the first change you make. You cast it in terms of finding something you love to do, because I am willing to bet among the people in this audience, those of you who have been happy in your jobs, it's because you love it, not because you made so much money at it, and it's been really important to you. And those who have not loved your job see that as a major loss in your life. Okay, so that's the first step. The second thing you want to do is to get rid of this artificial division whereby somehow being a lawyer is more fun than being a cabinet maker, more fulfilling, more important. It's not. All of our careers, whether we are history professors or cabinet makers or whatever we do, we go through a couple of phases. We all start out as apprentices, and we all know that we didn't stop being apprentices when we got our college degree. That's when our apprenticeship really started in most cases, and we continued being apprentices while we were making a living. Then we become journeymen. We become competent at what we do. And the lucky ones among us become master craftsmen. So let's stop thinking of history professors or CEOs as having one kind of success in the world, and people who are master craftsmen at being cabinet makers as being another kind. They're all doing the same thing. And recognizing that common kinship in what we're striving to do, I think is absolutely essential in combating what is becoming a very poisonous kind of class division in this country. I've gone astray from your question, but I wanted to say all of that. Thank you.
You know, that was very well said, and I think at the heart of it is what you're trying to say: there's nobility to work, and using your talents and what God has given you to put at the service of yourselves, your family, and fellow man. And that's part of what seems to be lost as we let government take more and more of the civil society over for us. I want to pick on you, and I don't think you're going to disagree with me. In your talk, you said some of these whole departments are entirely useless, and I think you would agree that many of them are worse than that, because they crowd out innovation in the private sector, and they disallow what we don't see. It was pointed out, this phenomenon that what we don't see when government does something is what would have happened if private resources had been redirected to their best ends. Just to make that comment. I think we have one more question.
And that's a great segue to my question, because that's also about education, and it's about the role of the for-profit education sector, the KIPP academies of the world and the Phoenix universities of the world. What do you see? They're clearly being demonized by the federal government. What do you see as their role in the evolution of the education system in this country?
I'm going to have to tell you that I am having a hearing problem, and I didn't get the last part of that question. Just the last, could you repeat the last bit of that question? Yeah.
What do you see as the future of the for-profit sector?
What is the future of the for-profit? Guess what? I can actually be optimistic for once. This is one of the few places. I think that we are looking at a set of market forces that are going to transform education. It's not going to happen because the Congress votes for different laws. I think these are ineluctable. I'm indebted to a guy named Peter Thiel, who is the guy who invented PayPal and was an early investor in Facebook, who's been quite involved in this issue. He's referring to higher education now as a bubble, in the same sense that real estate was a bubble. And we've had other kinds of tech bubbles and so forth. In this sense, more and more people are beginning to realize that all this money they're paying for higher education isn't worth it. Their kids are not getting a liberal education, liberal in the classic sense of the term, so they aren't coming out of college as educated men and women, but neither are they learning how to make a living. They are accumulating huge student debts, and so on the cost side, you have all sorts of reasons that a lot of people are going to say, you know what, I know it's hard to get a job interview without a college education, but I just can't go this route. On the other side, look what you have happening in terms of the resources for conducting education. The information technology revolution has revolutionized what can be done with distance learning, what you can do over the internet, the ways in which you can obtain training that you need at far lower costs than going to a residential facility. All of these things are growing despite the lack of interest of the government and encourage them, and indeed all the ways in which teachers' unions, the rest of it, impede them. But all of these are extremely powerful, they're extremely effective, and I expect 10 years from now, post-secondary education is going to be radically different from the way we see it now, and it's the information technology revolution which will have made it happen, and it's going to be great.
Are you going to make an announcement?